In continuing our journey as one team at the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, our focus remains on the quality of patient care and their safety. We have state-of-the-art buildings, leading-edge equipment, and application of evidence-based results. Yet these alone are not sufficient. For what is a building with patients and no staff to address their needs? You, the staff, are the jewels of the operation and integral to the success of Walter Reed Bethesda. What you do matters. Our patients deserve only the best. Remember, we are the nation's medical center, creating extraordinary experiences for patients, families, and staff while driving tomorrow's healthcare advances. It's our house.
Hi, I'm Colonel Chuck Callahan. The purpose of this video today is to talk about trust and a culture of trust. I've had the privilege of being in the National Capital area for now 5 years, involved with BRAC, involved with organizations coming together. And if someone were to ask me what's the single thing that we need to focus on, what's the single area that's been most challenging, I would say that it's establishing a culture of trust between the organizations, between the services, as we form what really will be the future of military medicine. I came over to National Naval Medical Center in the summer of 2010, a year before the physical move, and I had the chance to be the first Army officer to serve as the Deputy Commander of the National Naval Medical Center in its 70-year history. It was a privilege for me, after spending 3 decades in Army uniform and Army organizations, beginning with the commission and the infantry, to towards the end of my career have this chance to serve alongside Navy personnel and in Navy medicine. And I found out very early on that one of the biggest things we had to get our arms around, the biggest things we had to understand, was cultural differences between our services and between other aspects of the professions that we represented. I wasn't here a week or 2 weeks before my commander at the time told me, after encountering a problem, that he wanted me to do a FOD walk on that and get back to him. I spent the next days Googling, trying to figure out what a FOD walk was, and realized about 3 or 4 days into it that I had spelled it wrong, and that it wasn't a FOB walk. It was a foreign object and debris walk that he wanted me to do to find problems that might be arising or causing what it was we were looking at. When I finally figured that out and got back to him, he told me Bravo Zulu, which I understood subsequent to that was actually a good thing. It was a congratulations. But it was an example to me of how the cultural differences were perhaps one of the last hurdles we had to overcome, and things that we were going to have to be honest with and be able to talk about as an organization for some time into the future. Culture is a set of repeated behaviors. Those behaviors are based on what we think and we feel, and those thoughts and feelings have their basis in belief sets that go all the way back to our beginnings. We may come in the Army as a young soldier, or the Navy as a young sailor, move to the officer ranks, and all along we are learning sets of beliefs about the culture, about the service, about their traditions. Those form the way we think and we feel, and they manifest themselves as culture, that pattern of repeated behaviors. 2 broad areas where I believe the Navy and the Army are significantly different than each other are the difference between command afloat and command afield, and it really is fundamentally a difference in command culture. The second is the way we operate, when we operate on a battleship versus a battlefield, and it has to do with operational culture. The command culture difference and the significance of that has everything to do with the isolated command at sea. And it harkens back to the days of the wooden sailing ships in the late 18th and early 19th century. Stories perhaps of Captain James Lawrence, the captain of the Chesapeake, as he sailed out of the Boston Harbor in 1813 and confronted the HMS Shannon. And in that battle that took only 15 or 20 minutes, James Lawrence uttered those famous words, "Don't give up the ship, fight her till she sinks," and took his place in Navy culture as one of the important, critical, early captains demonstrating that command at sea. Or we could talk about the British tradition we have going back to Lord Nelson and battles like Trafalgar and others, where the sailing ship and the isolated command at sea become a centerpiece of understanding Navy leadership. The biggest enemy to the isolated command at sea is in fact anarchy, and the idea that the crew would rise up and resist the authority of the officers at sea. Well, here's a contrast that jumps right out at us, those of us who have worn an Army uniform for all of our careers. The Army notion of command very often is one of controlled anarchy. On the battlefield, we encourage leaders at every level to act on their own initiative, to take things into their own hands as they need to, as the battle shapes and changes. So this notion of command anarchy and the challenges of anarchy at sea are two reasons why command culture is so different. It comes down to simple things like me answering the skipper with the words aye, which means I have taken a legal order and I am legally obligated to fulfill it. In the Army, very often when I'm asked to do something, my answer will be the phrase hua, which is a very difficult thing to trace in terms of its origins. Most people think that it stands for HUA, which stands for heard, understood, and acknowledged. A second big difference between the cultures of the Army and the Navy have to do with the way the two services traditionally solve problems. And it focuses on the notion of operating on a battleship versus operating on a battlefield. On a battlefield, and as the Army solves problems, we tend to solve them with people and stuff. In the summer of 1944, as the Allies spread across Europe, breaking out of the beachhead after Normandy, very quickly it became apparent that we were short about 300,000 people and millions of tons of supplies and gasoline. The Red Ball Express was put into place using 6,000 vehicles to move 12,000 tons of supplies a day to keep the Army supplied with people and stuff as it swept across Europe. Operating on a battleship is a very different thing because there's no room for more people and more stuff. When faced with a problem at sea, the chances are our best outcome is going to come from looking at our process and looking at the procedures and seeing whether those can be refined in such a way that the problem can be solved. You don't have to go very far to see the importance of this than to look past the situation in the Gulf of Tonkin. The USS Forrestal was preparing for a day of operations, and the flight deck was loaded with jets that were both fully fueled and fully armed. The Phantom jets that were on the flight deck had, as part of their safety mechanisms, 2 steps that needed to be completed before the rocket pod launchers were ready to launch, the second of which was wiring them for ignition. That wasn't to be done until the jets were ready to take off. On this particular day, in order to move the flight process along, those wires had been attached. And when they flipped from external to internal power, a power surge in one of the jets caused the rocket to launch. It struck another jet. The fire and explosions that went on the ship for the next 18 hours were responsible for 134 lives and 169 wounded. That is burned into the memory both of the U.S. military, but in the Navy in particular, as an example of why process and procedure is so critical for our success. So while the Army looks at the problem and throws people and stuff in that direction, the Navy is very apt to refine the process, refine the procedure, and look to making the process and procedure tighter and better controlled. It's not hard to imagine how the two cultures would have conflict around that very thing, where the Army would want to hold very tightly to the people and the logistics, the equipment that we have, and the Navy, when faced with changing or modifying process, would point out how those processes and procedures, even in a healthcare organization, have been hard fought and won over a long period of time. As we continue into the future as a joint organization, we will have Army officers and Navy officers, soldiers and sailors, civilians that are used to operating in each of the independent systems coming into this new hospital totally unfamiliar with the evolving culture of excellence that we have as a single organization. That ongoing process of understanding each other's culture will be key to our success in the future. In the final analysis, the reason why this is so important, the reason why the merger of the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center is so crucial to the Department of Defense and to the American people who have entrusted us with the care of their sons and daughters, is because what we have in common is greater than what we don't. The sum total of each of our individual strengths coming together creates something that's greater than either would have been on its own. And in the final analysis, that combination of strengths that we derive from our independent services, from our medical cultures, and even from the organizations we come to, leaves us with an unstoppable team and an unstoppable set of processes and procedures that we would never find, we would never experience if we hadn't come together. In the end, the only real hindrance, the only real challenge that we have to overcome is ourselves.